if I think objectively about my dad and who he was, my childhood memories of him, he was a really funny guy. Like, always had great jokes, always had great stories, and was very fun to listen to. He was interesting, he was warm, and that's what probably makes this whole thing so hard is that you had no indication he was doing something like what he did. So I always connected with him, and even though he was working a lot and wasn't as present as much as he should have been, so for instance, in a retail business that's opened 9 p.m. 5 days a week, he wasn't always home for dinner, but he'd be home at 9 or 9:30 at night, and you'd be excited when he came home. And so even though he wasn't present like most fathers were, I still had a great connection with him, and we were very close. I was really content and happy with the relationship we had, and I felt like he was always there when I needed him. We had what felt like a very normal existence growing up on the North Shore. It's a very affluent community. We were kind of right in the middle of that scene there. We weren't the most affluent people, but we weren't struggling to be a part of that community. And my father worked a lot. He owned a car dealership in Schaumburg, and he was there 6 days a week, sometimes seven, long hours. And I worked for him at times throughout my teenage years and college years. But we just felt like a very ordinary, normal North Shore family without any idea that there could be anything else going on. As I got into my teenage years and my father wasn't home as much as my mother wanted him to be. Like, for instance, he liked to fish, and that was a hobby, a supposed hobby. We all fished with him at times in our lives, so we knew he fished. But about once a month or so, he would usually call her on Saturday afternoon from the car store and say, "Hey, I'm going to go fishing tomorrow." And so he'd say, "I'm not going to be home tonight. I'm going to drive up to Wisconsin, spend the night, fish all day Sunday. I'll be home Sunday night." And that always upset my mother because, on the one hand, she understood he needs an outlet because he didn't really play golf or have any other hobbies. But on the other hand, it really upset her that it was a Saturday night and we were going to be home sitting, basically doing nothing while he was off fishing. In retrospect, we find out that he was probably just 6.5 miles away in Glenview with another family. So my mother had an interesting conversation with my father about his health. And he said, "Hey, when I was away fishing over the weekend, I had a mild stroke and I drove myself to the hospital and at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. And I had some impact to one of my legs, and I'll be here for the next 5, 6 weeks doing rehab." And none of that sat well with my mother because she had been under the impression he was away fishing with some buddies 6 hours from Chicago. So in her mind, she's thinking, "Well, did you leave the guys fishing to drive 6 hours to the hospital? And who drives 6 hours to the hospital when you just had a stroke?" So red flags went up. She called the hospital and spoke to a nurse, and she identified herself as Norm Zimmerman's wife. And there was an awkward silence, and the nurse said, "Oh, I just met you." Of course, my mother didn't register with her because my mother was in Arizona at the time. So she hung up from that conversation, really perplexed, and she contacted me and told me the events. And I said, "Hey, I'll call the hospital, see what I can find out." I got a nurse on the phone and very transparent with me about why he was there. He had gone in for an elective heart valve replacement, and he'd gone in on Monday, and here we are 2 days later. He did have a mild stroke during the procedure. That part was true, and he was going to be there for 5, 6 weeks doing recovery. I said, "Okay, I'm on the East Coast. I just want to make sure someone's checking up on him. And is anyone there been there to see him?" And they said, "Oh yeah, your mom and your sister and her baby were here." And I said, "Oh," I said, "I don't think those are my relatives, but I'm glad someone's checking on them." Hung up the phone and I called my mother and I said, "This is what I found out. Sounds like we have some work to do." And at that point, we started digging into the internet and we found out this picture that there was a whole other family unit associated with my father's name when we started doing people searches. There was a part of me that was hoping, hey, maybe this is just a mix up, right? Crossed wires. The nurse who spoke to my mother didn't realize who she was talking to, and maybe it was a mix up. But I was happy to get the details of his health and what was really going on. That was clarifying because then you knew he was up to something. The feeling was when she said, "Oh, your mother and sister and her baby were here," that really sent up alarms, stress and anxiety about, okay, what do we have to figure out here? So my mom and I talked on the phone that night, and I just said, "Hey, let's just start searching the internet, searching his name." And there's various different sites. Many of them require you to pay to get the deep details. We did searches on our father's name and our names, and our family unit would come up with our approximate ages, the homes that we had lived in Winnetka with the addresses, phone numbers. Then there was just one other name, that this woman's name who had the same last name as us, and she was about the same age as my mother and father, a little younger. So we're like, gosh, is this a cousin of Norm's that we don't know about? That was our initial thought. It's, gosh, maybe he's got this cousin we don't know about, but we've never heard of her. And so we started doing searches on her name. And then his name would be associated with hers. And then there'd be these two adults who were about the same age as my brother and I, a boy and a girl, male and female. And we're like, well, gosh, this kind of looks like a whole other unit here. We felt like we needed help. So we hired a private detective. We all agreed, hey, let's get back together in about 10 days and see what we've both found out. So we continued to do research. And then the private detective came back with his research. And it really painted a picture because he was able to pull property records and identify that there was a home in Morton Grove, and then a home in Glenview, and then now a home in Lake Forest. And those addresses matched what we had done with our online searches. We're figuring out that there's this other party, this other unit that he's had a relationship with. We thought, maybe he's been having an affair for the last decade or so. But then when you saw the ages of the individuals and you saw the locations and the properties, it painted a much more solidified picture that this wasn't a recent relationship. This was a long-term, 4-decade-long relationship. It's interesting that the way we got the name of the private detective was because my father had an affair with a subordinate at the car dealership in the late 80s, early 90s. And that woman's estranged husband had hired a private detective to follow my father. And eventually, when that detective had put his package of research together, the estranged husband came to my mother's house in Winnetka, my parents' house in Winnetka, and confronted my mother with the photographs and details showing that my father was spending time outside of work with his estranged wife, who also worked for my father. So we had gone through that situation and digested it. And my father and that subordinate at work really explained it away and insisted there was nothing there. So we had digested the concept, even though I really felt like there probably was an affair there. We were comfortable in the sense that that may have happened and you can work through that. The concept of a whole other family, especially over a span of 4 decades, that no longer is about how he was spending his time at work. That was now affecting us for 4 decades about how he spent his time with us or didn't. That double life with another family, it drew the curtain back on all the things you now say, well, gosh, he could have done XYZ better. And now we know why he wasn't here for various different things at different times. Now also took singular red flag moments over a long span of time that individually didn't raise to a level of suspicion. And now it made all those red flags tell a story. So my mother had decided while he was doing physical rehabilitation at Northwestern that she would file for divorce very quickly. She was not going to stick around. And there was then obviously all these concerns about, well, we don't really know what's in his estate. He's just had a health event with a stroke. He could have more strokes. We don't know what's going to happen to him. Basically, my mother wanted out of the marriage, and she also wanted to find out what there was and ensure that she was able to secure her future and extract herself from what was apparently becoming very clear a toxic marriage that had been full of lies and deceit for decades. So my mother had him served at the hospital. She felt if he got out and went home to the house in Lake Forest, they could evade being served, but just by not answering the door, and it might lengthen the process. So she decided to have him served, and he was served. And the first phone call was to me, and he said, "Mike, it's Dad." And I said, "Oh, how you doing?" We were anticipating someone was going to get the phone call. We knew the day he was being served, and he said, "Mike, did you know Mom was divorcing me?" And I said, "Yeah, I do know that." And he said, "Well, why?" And I said, "Wow, we found out that you have a secret double life." And he said, "Oh, I better call your mother." And he hung up the phone. Hour and a half later, my mom calls me and says, "I just talked to your father for the last hour." I said, "Okay, well, what happened?" And she said, "Hey, he said there's going to be revelations." And he had two questions for her, or two statements really. One was, "How much money do you want?" To which she said, "I don't know because I don't know what you have." And the second one, he said, "I guess this ends my relationship with the boys," meaning my brother and I. She said, "Well, gosh, that's really going to be up to how you want to handle the outcome of this with Michael and Alan." We didn't have all the information that he did at that time. He knew who the other parties were and whether they would or would not accept us. The worst case scenario for him was my mother divorcing him, because then it risked getting into his finances and then potentially the other family finding out about us. I think it was more his realization that he knew who the other parties were and that it would never fly with them, him continuing to have a relationship with us. And I say that because at that juncture, he was living here and still working, actually just sold the business and was still in the process of winding down all the records and closing everything. But because of the stroke, he was no longer able to drive. And so, as long as he was free bird, could go anywhere he wanted, he could live with that woman in Lake Forest. And when any of us came to town, he could just spend that time with us and no one would know otherwise. But once he was no longer free and clear on his own, and he now relied upon them to take care of him and someone to drive him, he knew he was probably not able to engage with us on his terms anymore. So during that first 6 months of the negotiation between my parents to try and settle their divorce, we were still engaging with my father. I was having conversations regularly with him, just as father and son. I came in a handful of times to sneak in basically and see him when he was at rehabilitation facilities on the North Shore. And, you'd sneak in and have like a half hour here or an hour there with him. And you're really just trying to like extract information and have a healthy dialogue in those little snippets of time with him. So, I was laser focused on the mission in that meeting, which was tell me what happened here, trying to foster a healthy relationship and extract information. And he would give up little bits and pieces here and there. And so we were able to determine about 5, 6 months in that they did not know about us. The kids had no idea at all. They thought he was traveling on business all the time. And we felt it was important for them to know about us. And we at the time, thought that was going to give us leverage against him or to put pressure on him to settle quickly with my mom. Ultimately, I think that backfired because then they were involved in the divorce process too. And so he was fighting a war on two fronts, which made it harder for him. She knew, I say she, the other woman, knew she was a kept woman. She knew she wasn't married to him. She had lied to not only their children about not being married to their father, she lied to her family, her parents. She knew she was in something, and this is what my father said. She knew she was in something, but she didn't know what it was. So he could never tell her what it was or who we were because he would risk her blowing up and exposing it, right? So my father really controlled that situation by not being married to her and holding it over her head in a sense that, hey, you stay in line or I walk and no one takes care of you and the kids. He could have basically said that. No, I don't think he would have, but it kept her within the boundaries of accepting the life that she was in and lying to everyone around her about the life she was in. I don't think the other woman knew my father had children with someone else. We will never know the lie he told her about why he couldn't marry her. My father took that to the grave, and I don't think the other woman knows enough, and I don't think she'd speak on it. He probably portrayed it as the relationship with my mother happened so long ago, but we're adults and we haven't been in his life in a long time, and that we're probably just coming around now at the end for money. As time went on, we realized she was an accomplice. How did he do this and keep it totally secret? Once we figured out certain details that she really had a role in helping him, that made it a lot easier for him, right? I just think as time went on and everyone was in their routines, it became easier for him. And I think the 70s were probably really tough because he had my half brother who was young, then I was born, then they had a daughter, and then my brother was born. That daughter of theirs died when she was 18 months old. And then they had another daughter who's my current half sister. So also, my grandfather died in 1976, and my father left the legal profession to take over the car store. So I think the 70s was crazy for him, thinking about juggling all those things, the loss of a child, the loss of his father. But then I think once he got past that decade and kids got older and they got into school and grade school and middle school, high school, routines got set and everything just worked. My mother and I would joke and say, he must have had spreadsheets keeping track of the kids, their friends' names, the parents' names of the friends, and like all of that. It's amazing. They were, as the crow flies, about 6.5 miles away in Glenview. You think how crazy that is. Today's standards, because our communities overlap so much with social media and the internet, I don't think he could pull this off today, right? He was able to do it in the 70s and 80s and early 90s because we were siloed. We had nothing to do with people in Glenview and probably vice versa. As crazy as it sounds, it worked. My father went to law school at Northwestern. He practiced law up until the mid 70s. He was a really bright guy and he figured a lot of stuff out. For instance, all those properties that they lived in were always held in trusts. So when we did property searches, his name doesn't come up, but the trusts do. So he hid those really well. In order to fund that family financially, he needed to do so without a paper trail. So the car store, and I learned this from his business manager, who was really essential in feeding us information after we caught my father. She was not in on it, but she worked side by side with him for over 20 years and really good friends with him at work. She had no idea he was doing this. But once we let her in on it, she was all on board with helping us. And she said, I would sit there in the office and there was a huge safe in the office. And she'd say, we would see him take large sums of cash from the safe. And we just assumed he was going and depositing it at the bank. Well, he was depositing it at the bank, but he was depositing it at the Glenview Bank where the other woman could then draw on it. So there was no direct paper trail between my father and this woman. There was just a bank account where she could access cash. One of the miscalculations I made along the way was when this first happened, I figured, you know what? And I was looking through the lenses of loving my father and still thinking about all the great things we had shared together. I'm like, you know what? He'll just make this go away quickly. Like he got caught, clean it up and make it go away, right? Settle with mom appropriately and we all move on. Well, the attorney and the car dealer side of him was the master negotiator. So he dug his heels in and was willing to make it a war of attrition and ride it out. And because he knew he was armed with all the information about the circumstances and we weren't, he figured, I'll drag this out, make discovery really hard, and see if my mom was willing to spend the money to go after it. And he figured, she wasn't. And eventually she got tired. So he won. He won that battle, right? And so we never got the forensic accountant involved. We never got deeper into things to find out how much money he really had. I think in retrospect, had the forensic accountant gotten involved and we got deeper into his finances, that may have applied enough pressure on him to step up to the plate and end it appropriately. But the mistake I made was thinking he'll fix it the right way. And what I was miscalculating was the fact that this was really a bad guy who'd been bad for 40 years. Was I silly to think he was suddenly going to do the right thing? So the day my parents got divorced in court, they all showed up. And into court comes my dad in the wheelchair, my half brother pushing the wheelchair, the other woman and my half sister, all looking as united front. And then, of course, in court, all the details are revealed. The judge reads everything, and my father has to say, yes, that's true. I was married to Ann for 47 years, and Michael and Alan are my kids. It was all there on the court record, right? It's legit, it's real. They heard it. So they can't dispute that, but who knows what they want to really believe, right? But there has to be some deep-seated anger there. The conversation I had with my half brother, the brief 20-second conversation when I Finally got his information a year and a half ago and called him. And I just said, "Hey, this is Michael, your half brother." And he paused and then he chuckled and said, "I don't have a half brother." And he hung up. So I called him back and then I left him a voicemail. And I said, "Actually, you're right. You don't have a half brother, you have two half brothers. So if you ever want to talk, you've got my number and you can call me." They've been so adversarial from the beginning. Once they were brought into this, and we notified my half sister of the existence of us, it really caused a lot of drama on my father's side there, because then the half sister and half brother confronted their parents. I'll always remember that. I got the phone call from my father. "Why'd you tell her everything?" I said, "Dad, she called me." And in the background, crying and screaming and yelling, is the other woman saying, "I can't believe they told them." She couldn't believe we told their children. So, my father had only given us bits and pieces of the story, but occasionally there'd be a situation like that where the other woman would exhibit behaviors which would help solidify the picture. And that told me a lot, right? By her saying, "I can't believe they told them," that to me meant she was in on it, right? She was an accomplice. So she was devastated now that her children had found out that there was something that wasn't exactly what everyone thought it was in their household. Shocking, right? And I remember the conversation I had with my half sister. And even she said this to my mother too, because she was in such disbelief. My half sister talked to my mother first and then me. She was shocked. She said, "This is impossible. My mother is a devout Catholic woman." She's like, "This is impossible. My mother's a devout Catholic woman. She has to be married to my father." And they gave the appearance, changed name. My father's name is on their birth certificates. All of this looks like the real deal to everybody on the outside. And that was probably the deal he made with her and said, "Hey, no one will ever know we're not really married. You'll have a ring, you'll have my name, I'll take care of you and the kids, and no one will be the wiser," right? I thought about it in the context that even though he wasn't legally married to her, one of the things he explained to me along the way was I was constantly probing him to explain this to me. And he said, "Mike, I think she just kind of considers it common law." And so, even though he wasn't trying to be married to both women, he was essentially living as such. He carried on for over 40 years with her family believing they were married, while he was really legally married to my mother. And for all intents and purposes, aside from the legal document, he was married to both women in the sense that he ran households with them, he took care of everybody. If she was just a girlfriend on the side, he wouldn't have participated at the level that he did, I think. But as far as they all knew, they were a family unit. So that's why I feel like it fulfills the definition of bigamy. We were the primary family. And I say that not only from a legal perspective, because he was legally married to my mother and he wasn't legally married to the other woman, not at that juncture. He married her after my parents were divorced. But we know where he spent 85% of his time, right? That family never worked at the car store. They were never a part of his day to day professional life, where he spent time. The conversation I had with my half sister, she revealed all kinds of details about their life. Things like he never vacationed with them, whereas he vacationed with us frequently. I think it made us feel better knowing that we were all on level footing. The idea that even though we were the first family, it's shocking and upsetting to find out that your father had been spending time with another family secretly, but reassuring to know that they weren't in on the secret and you were a second class citizen as a result. We were all really kind of equals. And I feel like all four children are equal victims in the whole grand scheme based on choices my father made. But emotionally, I always felt like, gosh, it was unfortunate what happened to all of us. Knowing how much time my father spent with us and not with them, I have a lot of empathy for what those kids experienced growing up and what they missed out on, and knowing fully why they missed out on it. Based on the limited interactions I've had with the members of that family, they are either bought off in believing that we're not real, or they were in denial or brainwashed, in the sense that they've been so defiant and accepting that he actually was with us and legally married to my mother, they just can't wrap their heads around it. Or I should say, they weren't willing to wrap their heads around it previously. I don't know if that's changed, but their behaviors were so adversarial and defiant and unwilling to say, hey, you know what? This is awful, but we do have things in common here and we can learn a lot from each other. They've never taken that approach. I think I've gained a lot of insight around that more recently. But for the longest time, I didn't grasp their reaction, being so adversarial towards us. I think part of that was driven by their parents when they circled the wagons after they found everything out. But I'm sure that was devastating for them to figure out too. Maybe even more so for them than us, in the sense that at the end of the day, we got 85% of this guy's time. My half brother's first 7, 8 years of his life were probably really tough, with his father not around, his sister dying, and then a new sister competing with him for attention, right? More recently, some of their former neighbors have reached out to me and said, hey, I want to talk to you. And I said, great, let's hop on the phone. And so they would describe what they observed. And as parents to children themselves, they would observe circumstances where my father wasn't around and he would show up infrequently. And the one neighbor said we thought he was in the mob because he'd show up wearing suits driving Lincolns. And I said, well, he always wore suits and he owned a Lincoln dealership. But that was their impression back in the 70s. I thought that was funny. But they just had this idea that they saw this household and they saw that this guy wasn't around and they thought something was up, but they didn't know what. But now that they look back on it, they say, wow, I feel really bad for those kids because we saw something happening where there was not a healthy, normal family unit there, and there were real restrictions on those children. So, for instance, those kids were not often allowed out of the house to play outside with the other kids. My half siblings supposedly were not allowed to go to neighbors' homes. And I'm sure that's because they didn't want any questions, any information, anything to come up. How come we never see your father? Or what's your father do for a living? Or where is he? Or so tight parameters were put around the freedom of those kids and when they were little. So I think about them and I imagine the challenges of their upbringing, which were really unbeknownst to them, may have informed some of their adversarial behavior towards us in the last decade. I don't agree with it, but it may have informed how they acted. You know, I come away from the whole thing thinking, gosh, he was a real sociopath and a narcissist to think he could pull all this off. And he did pull it off, right? In some of our conversations, he would say things like, did you go wanting for anything? I took care of everybody. So he chalked it up materially to say, hey, I took care of all of you. I did the right thing. I wasn't a deadbeat dad. So he was giving himself a pat on the back for that. And in my mind, only the narcissist would think about this situation. You've got people you supposedly love and care about expressing to you the hurt you've caused through the choices you've made. And your response is, hey, I took care of everyone. So, I don't think he cared a whole lot about the emotional side of it. I think he really detached himself from it. And I think the reason for that is he got away with it for so long. I think he was mad he got caught. To think about why he did it for as long as he did, I think he felt an obligation to take care of everybody. That's part of it. And then I think there was the other part of it, which was there was a degree of risk for him if he didn't take care of everyone, right? So he had obligations to fill. He filled them. But at any point along the way, if he stopped fulfilling those, he potentially risked red flags going up. And then that could prompt reactions from either side to dig into it and find out why. He got stuck, essentially. I don't think he was a young attorney playing the field with women in Chicago saying, this is my goal, right? Now, the next question is, well, then why keep having children with the other woman? And there's various theories on that. One would be maybe he really loved her and wanted to have more children with her. She had accepted that she was going to be a kept woman, but she really wanted to further lock him up. Or the other side of that is perhaps he was utilizing that as a way to control her, because with more children, she would really be under his control. There was a real 4 or 5 year stretch that it really unraveled all aspects of my life. Personally, I was clinging to my job for, just getting by at work. But in all other aspects of my life, I spent the first year and a half really supporting my mother through the divorce. And then thinking, hey, there's still this stuff to resolve with my dad. We're still going to have some sort of a relationship. But then after he divorced my mother and married the other woman right away, walls went up there. and they really protected him from us. And so we had very limited access to him. So then I went into this phase where I was mourning the loss of my father, really. And it was strange because you're mourning the loss of someone who's still alive and still there. And you can't rationalize why you're being denied access to him, right? My mother and I would talk about it, and she'd say, I would never deny those kids access to their father. It just doesn't make sense. I don't care what the circumstance between me and your father are, they have a right to see their kids, right? Their father. And so I went through a long period there where I was really, and I didn't realize what I was going through at the time, but I was really trying to reconcile the loss of my father and figure out what it meant. It had been a real emotional roller coaster. And then I got to around 2016 where we had no contact with him anymore. In the last 4 or 5 years of his life, we had no contact at all. And so finally, you found yourself, family was broken up. You had no relationship with your dad anymore. You had this adversarial family unit, which was denying you any relationship with him. And none of it made sense. And you were depressed. And nothing was evolving. The details with my father weren't changing. It was just very neutral. He was there, but he wasn't. You couldn't talk to him. You didn't know how his health was. You didn't have updates. And that's the other thing. It's one thing if they want to put walls up, but denying us access to information about his health. And ultimately, when he died, they didn't tell us he was sick. So there was a long period of my life just falling apart. And it took me a while to figure out it was happening. And then I figured out it was happening. And I just didn't know what to do to fix it. I needed something to change, some like catalyst to spark change. And day after day, I'd wake up and nothing was changing. We were just kind of in a fog, drifting aimlessly about what do I do with myself? And, there's aspects to the finances where my brother and I really got shafted. My grandfather had set up trusts at the car dealership. Trust was set up and supposed to flow the money from my grandfather's trust through my father's next of kin. And at the time, my grandfather thought we were the only next of kin. And the trustee of the trust was my father. So my father was able to shield those assets in the trust from us because he was the trustee and use them for his purposes. So we never got that money. My grandfather worked hard to start that business, set it up to ensure a financial future for my brother, and I and my father squandered it. And I think that's the cash that he was always pulling from. That's how he funded this other family. I started going to therapy, and that helped to kind of talk through everything. And then I also realized, we pulled the curtain back on my dad's life, and he'd lived this life that was ridiculous. And I really got honest with myself and pulled the curtain back on my life too. And I realized, I was like, Jesus, I've done a lot of the same stuff he has. I mean, he was subtly modeling to us these behaviors our whole life, even though he wasn't overtly doing it. He was modeling, you're your own man. You don't answer to anybody. You're independent. You come and go as you please, and you call the shots. And so that's how my brother and I really conducted our lives in relationships with women. So I was like, here I am doing the same stuff as he is, except I didn't start families with two women, but there were similarities. And I really had to take stock and be like, hey, this isn't healthy. Look where it's gotten me. And there was a real reckoning for myself in the sense that I needed to change as well, or I was going to end up headed down who knows what path, an unhealthy path like my father's. So I dug myself out of it. I had been dating my now wife on and off through that period of time. I obviously wasn't great dating material during that era. My life was a mess. So we got back together. I knew she wanted to start a family, and I said, let's do this. And I'm a father to a son now. And there's a huge element to being a father to a son that resonates with my experience here with my father. I'm sure I would have been thrilled being a father to a daughter as well. But just being father son, I often have already thought about moments with my son. He'll turn 4 next week. And I've spent so much time with him in the first 4 years of his life, time that I know my father wasn't spending with me or his other children. And I look at it and I feel like my father really missed out on the really wonderful aspects of spending that type of time with his children because his interests were so divided and he was always in between places. Whereas I think I will always, as I continue to experience things with my son, think about those similar moments with my dad or how my dad didn't do those things with me. And I think that'll shape the course I take with my son.
Next week, it's New Year's Eve, when we give you a sneak peek of what to expect in 2024. From Superphonic Studios, this is Chicago. Happy holidays.